At 7:32 a.m. on February 10, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Thach watched 6 Japanese Zeros diving toward his 4 Wildcats over Wake Island. He knew his pilots had perhaps 90 seconds to live. Thach was 37 years old, with 214 hours logged in Wildcats, but 0 confirmed kills against Zeros. The Japanese had dispatched 18 Mitsubishi A-6 Emiro fighters to sweep American patrols from the morning skies. The American Wildcat was simply slower. The Zero climbed quicker, turned tighter, and could outmaneuver any American fighter at any altitude. Both the Japanese and American pilots understood the brutal reality. A Zero could outturn a Wildcat in a mere 14 seconds. 14 seconds to secure a tail position, 14 seconds to line up guns, 14 seconds to kill. By February, the Pacific Fleet had tragically lost 43 Wildcats in 1-versus-1 dogfights with Zeros. 43 funerals. The pattern never varied. An American pilot engaged, the Zero outturned him. The Zero shot him down. Command continued to issue the same directives. Avoid turning engagements, run if possible. But fleeing meant abandoning wingmen, allowing Zeros to strafe his comrades while he escaped. Thach commanded Fighting Squadron the 3, 4 pilots, 4 Wildcats, 4 men who trusted him to keep them alive. But he had no answer for the Zero's tight turn radius, no solution for its superior climb rate, no answer but to watch good men perish. 3 days prior, Thach had been staring at a pack of wooden matches in his quarters at Naval Air Station San Diego, a care package from his wife. He had been consumed by the Zero problem for weeks. How do you defeat an opponent who is faster, more agile, and flown by veterans with 2 years of combat experience? Thach took 2 matches, held them parallel, and then moved them in opposite directions, weaving them past each other. They crossed and recrossed, never separating, always protecting the other. A breakthrough happened. What if 2 Wildcats didn't fight as individuals? What if they flew as a tight weaving pair? If a Zero got on the tail of the first Wildcat, that pilot would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would turn toward him. They would cross paths, and the Zero pursuing the first Wildcat would fly directly into the sights of the second Wildcat's guns. It was an insane idea. It violated every fighter doctrine in the U.S. Navy manual. Fighters were supposed to split up and fight one-on-one. That was the established dogma since 1918. But Thach couldn't shake the image of those weaving matches. He couldn't stop thinking about the 43 deceased pilots. If you want to witness how this desperate matchstick weave actually fared against the relentless Zeros, hit that like button right now, share this video with someone who loves history, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Back to Thach. He had summoned his wingman, Lieutenant Edward O'Hare, that night. After seeing the matches and hearing the explanation, O'Hare stared for 30 seconds. Then he asked, "When do we test it?" 4 days later, Thach was about to find out if his matchstick trick would save lives or kill 4 pilots. The 6 Zeros were 200 yards out and closing quickly. He reached for the radio, time to execute something unprecedented in combat. Thach's voice crackled across the frequency. "Weave on my mark." His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, was 800 feet to his right. 2 more Wildcats, piloted by Ensigns Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Coulson, flew 1,000 feet beyond Bassett. 4 American fighters in a loose formation. 6 Zeros diving from 11,000 feet. Standard doctrine demanded, split up, turn independently, fight alone. But Thach keyed his radio and gave an order never before uttered in U.S. Navy combat. "Bassett on me, weave pattern, execute." Bassett turned his Wildcat toward Thach. Thach turned toward Bassett. They flew directly at one another. The Zeros dropped to 8,000 feet. Japanese pilots likely assumed the Americans were panicking, believing 2 Wildcats were about to collide. But Thach and Bassett did not collide. At 400 yards, both pilots banked sharply. Thach pulled left, Bassett pulled right. They crossed paths with only 200 feet of separation. They continued turning, coming back around across again, a figure 8 pattern. 2 aircraft weaving back and forth like the matches on Thach's desk. The lead Zero pilot selected Bassett, committing to the tail chase, closing to 600 yards. Standard Zero strategy: get close, exploit superior maneuverability, and hammer the target with 20mm cannon fire. The Zero pilot expected Bassett to try to turn with him, an easy kill, but Bassett didn't turn away. He turned toward Thach. The Zero followed, lining up its guns. 500 yards, 400 yards. The Zero pilot had Bassett centered, 3 seconds from firing. Then, Thach's Wildcat came screaming through the weave pattern from the opposite direction. The Zero pilot faced a new crisis. He was chasing Bassett, who was flying directly toward another Wildcat, and that Wildcat had guns aimed right at him. Thach opened fire at 300 yards, 650 caliber machine guns, 70 rounds per second. The Zero pilot had one choice: break off the attack or fly into a wall of bullets. He broke off, pulled hard right, and climbed away. The other 5 Zeros scattered. For the first time in Pacific combat, Zeros were fleeing Wildcats. Sheedy and Coulson had observed the weave working. Now they attempted it. Sheedy turned toward Coulson. Coulson turned toward Sheedy. Another Zero committed to Coulson's tail, closing to 400 yards. Then Sheedy sliced through the weave, and the Zero pilot flinched, pulled up, and disengaged. The dogfight lasted 6 minutes. 6 Japanese Zeros versus 4 American Wildcats. The expected outcome was 4 dead Americans. But when the Zeros finally climbed away and headed northwest, all 4 Wildcats were still flying. Thach checked his fuel and his wingman. No one was hit, no one was killed. The weave had succeeded. Thach landed at Ford Island 40 minutes later. His hands were shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline, and from the staggering realization that perhaps American pilots didn't have to die every time they encountered Zeros. But Fighter Command remained unconvinced. Thach filed his combat report that afternoon, detailing the weave and advocating for its immediate adoption across all fighter squadrons. The response 3 days later: interesting tactic, needs further testing, not approved for widespread use. Thach stared at the refusal. 43 pilots were dead since February, and Command wanted more testing. Meanwhile, the Japanese were planning something far larger, something that would test the weave against impossible odds. In 68 days, Thach would be flying over an island called Midway, facing 50 Zeros with only 8 Wildcats. Between February and June 1942, Thach trained Fighting Squadron 3 on the weave every single day. Morning flights, afternoon flights, night formations. When the moon allowed, his pilots flew the pattern until they could execute it blindly. Turn toward your wingman, cross, turn back, cross again. Simple in theory, brutal in practice at 300 cheering with Zeros shooting at you. The Navy still had not officially approved the tactic, but Thach didn't wait. He taught it to every pilot who would listen. He showed them the matches, drew diagrams, and explained the geometry. If a Zero commits to your tail, you turn into your wingman. The Zero must choose, follow you into your wingman's guns, or break off. Either way, you survive. Some pilots grasped it instantly. Others thought Thach was mad. One squadron commander told him the weave violated basic fighter doctrine. You can't fly toward another aircraft in combat. You'll collide. You'll panic. You'll get both pilots killed. But Thach persisted because pilots kept dying. By May, the Pacific Fleet had lost 91 Wildcats to Zeros, 91 funerals, and Fighter Command still issued the same orders. Avoid engagement when possible. Run if outnumbered. The orders amounted to give up and die. Then naval intelligence intercepted Japanese radio traffic. Codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor decrypted the messages. The Japanese were preparing a massive assault on Midway Island. 4 aircraft carriers, 270 aircraft, the largest carrier operation in Japanese naval history. The attack was scheduled for June 4, 1942. Admiral Chester Nimitz recalled every available carrier to Pearl Harbor. He had 3, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet. The Japanese had 4, plus 2 years of combat experience, plus Zeros that outperformed anything the Americans flew. The math was terrifying. American carriers were outnumbered, American pilots were outmatched, and Midway Island's runway would be reduced to rubble within the first 30 minutes. Fighting Squadron 3 received deployment orders on May 26th. Report to USS Yorktown. Prepare for carrier operations. Thach understood. Immediately, his squadron would fly combat air patrol over Yorktown, protecting the carrier from bombers, fighting Zeros, and likely dying. He gathered his 7 pilots that evening. 7 men, 7 Wildcats, 7 lives. Dependent on a matchstick trick the Navy still hadn't officially approved. Thach showed them the matches one final time, explained the weave one final time. Then he delivered the truth. The Japanese are bringing 50 Zeros to Midway, maybe more. We'll have 8 Wildcats. Maybe fewer if Enterprise or Hornet lose fighters before the battle. The only way we survive is the weave. The only way we protect Yorktown is the weave. The only way we win is the weave. One pilot asked the obvious. What if it doesn't work? What if we weave and the Zeros just shoot us anyway? Thach had no simple answer. He simply showed them the matches again. Showed them how 2 matches weaving could cover each other, protect each other, and survive together when surviving alone was impossible. Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor on May 30th. 4 days to Midway. 4 days to prepare for the battle that would decide the Pacific War. 4 days to pray that a matchstick trick would hold up when 50 Zeros came screaming out of the sky. Because on June 4th at 0930 hours, Thach would look up and see a sight no American pilot had ever faced. A sky completely dark with Japanese fighters. June 4th, 1942, hour 0930 hours. Thach was at 14,000 feet above Yorktown when the first Japanese strike wave appeared. 18 HE dive bombers escorted by 12 Zeros. Not the massive formation predicted, but 12 Zeros was still 3-to-1 odds against Thach's 4-plane section. The Zeros came in high, at 15,000 feet. Standard Japanese doctrine, gain the altitude advantage, dive on the American fighters, and use speed and agility to dominate. Thach counted his own aircraft against the enemy, 4 Wildcats, 12 Zeros. He keyed the radio. Weave pattern, execute on my mark. His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, was 600 feet to his right. 2 more Wildcats behind them. The Zeros dove. Thach watched them commit and pick targets. 3 Zeros broke toward Thach. 4 went after Bassett. The others continued toward Yorktown. Thach gave the order. Mark, execute. He turned sharply toward Bassett. Bassett turned toward him. They crossed paths at 12,000 feet. The 3 Zeros chasing Thach instantly faced the problem. Their target was flying directly at another Wildcat, and that Wildcat's guns were pointing at them. The lead Zero pilot hesitated for just 2 seconds. At combat speed, 2 seconds is 400 yards. Thach sliced through the weave and opened fire. .50 caliber rounds tore through the Zero's engine cowling. The Zero rolled left, trailing thick black smoke, and dropped away. Thach's first Zero kill. But the other 2 Zeros didn't break off. They had witnessed the weave, recognized the pattern, and adapted. Instead of committing to Thach's tail, they split. One went high, one went low. They tried to attack from multiple angles, forcing Thach to choose which threat to counter. Thach pulled into a climbing turn toward the high Zero. Bassett broke toward the low Zero. The weave pattern fractured for 6 critical seconds. Both Wildcats were now fighting independently, exactly what Thach had tried to avoid. The high Zero got guns on Thach at 800 yards. 20mm cannon fire walked up Thach's left wing. 2 rounds punched through the wing root. 1 went through his cockpit canopy, just 3 inches from his head. Thach felt the shockwave and aluminum fragments hitting his flight suit, but he held the turn. Bassett called over the radio. I'm hit. Repeat, I'm hit. Thach looked left. Bassett's Wildcat was streaming white smoke. A coolant leak, maybe worse. The low Zero was still on his tail, hammering him with machine gun fire. Thach made a choice. He abandoned his turn toward the high Zero and dove toward Bassett. The weave was broken, but the underlying principle still held. Get between your wingman and the threat. Thach swept down on the low Zero from 7 spoo high. 600 yards, 500, 400. He opened fire. The Zero exploded. Pieces of wing and fuselage tumbled through the air. Bassett's Wildcat was shaking, losing altitude. Thach ordered him, go! He told the other 2 Wildcats to provide escort. That left Thach alone at 11,000 feet with 10 Zeros still airborne. The weave worked with a wingman. Without one, Thach was just another Wildcat pilot trying to survive. He turned toward Yorktown, beginning a descent. 3 Zeros spotted him and turned to intercept. Thach looked for friendly fighters. He saw 4 Wildcats from another squadron 3 miles east. too far to help. The 3 Zeros were closing fast. Thach had no wingman, no weave, and no option but to run. But running meant leading Zeros directly to Yorktown, the carrier his squadron was sworn to protect. He keyed his radio, called for help, and told the other Wildcats that he was engaging 3 Zeros solo. He told them, if the weave worked, they'd see the proof. If it didn't work, tell his wife he loved her. Thach turned his Wildcat toward 3 Zeros and prepared to test whether a matchstick trick could save a single pilot's life. Thach was at 9,000 feet when the 3 Zeros reached firing range. He was alone, no wingman to weave with, no support. But he had spent 4 months studying the weave's geometry, and he realized something profound. The weave didn't strictly require 2 aircraft. It required 2 points in space. He turned sharply right, then immediately reversed left. Sharp, angular turns. Not the smooth, predictable turning fight the Zeros expected. The lead Zero committed to following Thach's right turn, but Thach was already reversing left. The Zero pilot had to correct, had to pull harder, and had to burn energy. Thach repeated the sequence: right turn, left reversal. The Zero followed right. Thach went left. The Japanese pilot was always half a second behind, constantly correcting, constantly reacting, and every correction cost speed, cost energy, and cost the altitude advantage. After 40 seconds of these reversals, the Zero was co-altitude with Thach. Same speed, same energy state. No advantage. The Zero pilot broke off and climbed away. The other 2 Zeros followed him. Thach had just proven something critical. The weave principle worked even without a wingman. Sharp reversals, constant changes of direction. Never let the enemy predict your next move. Force them to react. Force them to bleed energy. Force them to quit. He landed on Yorktown 20 minutes later. Bassett was already aboard. His Wildcat had taken 4 hits, but the engine held together. The other pilots of Fighting Squadron 3 were debriefing. They had all witnessed Thach's solo fight. Word spread through the fighter squadrons that afternoon. Thach's weave works, even solo, even outnumbered. By evening, pilots from Enterprise and Hornet were lining up to ask Thach to explain the tactic. He showed them the matches, drew diagrams, and demonstrated the reversals. Some pilots tested it that night, practicing the weave in pairs over the carrier group. By June 5th, 18th Wildcat pilots could execute the pattern. By June 6th, 32 pilots. The weave spread through the fleet faster than any official doctrine ever could. Japanese pilots noticed. Radio intercepts from June 7th included references to new American tactics, American fighters flying in coordinated pairs, American fighters executing unpredictable maneuvers, and American fighters that refused to die. One message from a Japanese fighter commander said, American Wildcat pilots have changed their methods. Expect increased resistance. On June 10th, Fighting Squadron 3 flew combat air patrol over a convoy near Midway. 8 Wildcats faced 14 Zeros. Thach called the weave. All 4 pairs executed. The Zeros attempted their standard tactics. Isolate individual Wildcats, use superior maneuverability. But every time a Zero committed to a Wildcat's tail, that Wildcat turned toward his wingman. Every time the Zeros tried to split a pair, both Wildcats turned toward each other. The pattern held. After 12 minutes, the Zeros broke off. They damaged 2 Wildcats but scored 0 kills. The Americans had shot down 3 Zeros, 3 confirmed kills. This was the first time in Pacific combat that Wildcats achieved a positive kill ratio against Zeros in a major engagement. Fighter Command finally took notice. On June 15th, Commander John Thach was ordered to report to Pearl Harbor to brief Admiral Nimitz and prepare a formal presentation on the weave tactic. The Navy wanted to evaluate whether this matchstick trick should become official doctrine. Thach arrived at Pearl Harbor on June 18th and spent 2 days preparing his briefing, diagrams, combat footage, pilot testimonials, kill ratios, survival statistics, everything command needed to see that the weave was effective. But while Thach prepared, Japanese intelligence was preparing their own counter-tactic. They had analyzed the new American methods, studied the weave pattern, and developed a way to break it, a way to kill both Wildcats at once. On June 21st, Thach briefed Admiral Nimitz on the weave, But on June 23rd, Fighting Squadron 3 would face 18 Zeros over Santa Cruz Island, and those Zeros would be using tactics specifically designed to destroy the Thach Weave. June 23rd, 1942. 8:15 hours, Santa Cruz Island. Fighting Squadron 3 was escorting a convoy when radar picked up 18 bogies inbound. 8 Wildcats, 4 pairs, standard weave formation. Thach had briefed Nimitz 3 days earlier, and Nimitz had authorized field testing of the weave across all Pacific fighter squadrons. Now, Thach was about to discover that the Japanese had done their homework too. The Zeros came in at 16,000 feet, but they didn't dive immediately. They circled and waited for 90 seconds. Strange behavior for Zeros, who always exploited their altitude advantage fast. Then Thach understood. The Zeros were coordinating. 6 Zeros broke left, 6 broke right, 6 stayed high. 3 groups, 3 angles of attack. They knew 2 Wildcats could protect each other from one direction, but 3 directions simultaneously, that was different. The attack hit at 0817. 6 dove from high, 6 came in from the left flank, 6 from the right. Thach called the weave, but his pilots hesitated. Which threat do you counter when danger comes from 3 sides? Lieutenant Bassett chose the high Zeros, turning into them, but this exposed his right flank to the right side group. Ensign Sheedy turned to cover Bassett's right, which broke the weave with his own wingman. Suddenly, all 4 pairs were fragmented. 8 Wildcats were fighting independently, exactly what the Japanese wanted. Thach saw the weave collapsing and keyed his radio. Reform pairs, lock onto your wingmen, execute standard weave, ignore the other groups. His pilots responded. Bassett turned hard toward his wingman, found him, and locked in. They executed the weave even with Zeros attacking from multiple directions. The high Zeros dove. Bassett turned toward his wingman. The Zeros followed, flying straight into his wingman's guns. 2 Zeros exploded. The others pulled up. The left group tried next. Thach and his wingman executed the weave. 1 Zero committed, flew through the crossing pattern, took in 50 caliber rounds through the cockpit, and fell away smoking. The right group attacked Sheedy's pair with the same result. The weave held. 0 crashed. After 8 minutes, the Japanese had lost 5 Zeros. The Americans had lost 0 Wildcats. The coordinated 3-direction attack had failed. The Zeros climbed away. But Thach knew the significance. The Japanese had adapted. They had studied the weave and developed counter-tactics. The fact that their counter-tactics failed didn't matter. What mattered was that Japanese. Command was taking the weave seriously enough to train pilots specifically to defeat it. That evening, Thach filed a combat report describing the 3-direction assault and how the weave held, recommending immediate, widespread adoption. No more testing, no more evaluation. The weave worked, period. The report reached Admiral Nimitz on June 25th, who forwarded it to Admiral King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. King read the kill ratios and survival statistics. 0 American losses, 5 Japanese losses, 8 Wildcats versus 18 Zeros. On June 29th, Admiral King issued Fleet Order 41-1942. All fighter squadrons in the Pacific Fleet would immediately adopt the Thach Weave as standard combat doctrine. Mandatory training for all pilots. Mandatory execution in all engagements. The matchstick trick was now official U.S. Navy tactics, but orders from Washington took time to reach every squadron and train every pilot. The Japanese didn't wait. On July 7th, over Guadalcanal, 32 Zeros would attack 12 Wildcats from 6 different squadrons. Some squadrons knew the weave, many did not. And the ones who hadn't learned would discover the hard way why Thach had been teaching with matches for 5 months. July 7th, 1942, Guadalcanal. 12 Wildcats from 6 different squadrons flew combat air patrol over Henderson Field. 4 pilots had trained on the Thach Weave. 8 had not. At 11:20 a.m., 32 Zeros appeared from the north. The 4 pilots who knew the weave immediately paired up and executed the pattern. The 8 who did not fought independently, traditional 1 versus 1 dogfighting. 22 minutes later, 6 Wildcats were shot down. All 6 were pilots who fought independently. The 4 pilots using the weave survived without damage. They claimed 7-0 kills between them. Admiral Halsey read that combat report and immediately issued orders. every fighter pilot in the South Pacific would learn the Thach Weave within 2 weeks, no exceptions. Training programs started on July 10th. Thach flew to Guadalcanal, spending 3 weeks teaching the weave to every squadron on the island. He showed pilots the matches, drew the diagrams, and flew demonstration patterns. By August 1st, 96 Wildcat pilots could execute the weave. By September 1st, 218 pilots. The tactic spread from the Pacific to the Atlantic, from carriers to land bases, and from Wildcats to other aircraft types. P-38 Lightning squadrons started using it. P-40 Warhawk squadrons. Even some bomber formations adapted the crossing pattern for defensive purposes. The results were immediate and dramatic. In June 1942, before the weave became doctrine, American fighters had a kill-to-loss ratio of 0.41 against zeros. For every 10 American fighters lost, Americans shot down 4 zeros. By October 1942, after widespread weave adoption, the ratio was 2.1. Americans were shooting down 2 zeros for every Wildcat lost. Japanese pilots despised it. Radio intercepts from September showed Japanese squadron commanders warning pilots about the American crossing pattern. Do not commit to tail chase. Do not follow American fighters into their wingman's guns. Disengage if Americans execute coordination tactics. But disengaging meant losing the fight, allowing American fighters to protect their bombers, and surrendering air superiority. The Zero was still faster and more agile than the Wildcat, but speed and maneuverability meant nothing if you couldn't get guns on target, and the weave made it almost impossible to get guns on target. By January 1943, the weave was standard doctrine across all U.S. fighter squadrons. The Army Air Force adopted it, the Marine Corps adopted it, and British Royal Navy pilots started learning it for their carriers. The tactic that began with 2 matches on a desk in San Diego had become the foundation of Allied fighter doctrine. Thach received the Navy Cross in February 1943. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the development of fighter tactics that have saved numerous American lives and contributed significantly to the success of U.S. naval aviation operations." But Thach cared less about medals and more about numbers. In the 6 months before the weave, the Pacific Fleet lost 137 Wildcats in combat with zeros. In the 6 months after the weave became doctrine, the fleet lost 41 Wildcats. 96 pilots who came home because 2 matches could cross paths. Fighter Command assigned Thach to training duty in March 1943, pulling him from combat operations and sending him back to San Diego to teach the weave to new pilots. He hated being away from the fight, but Command knew he was more valuable as an instructor than as a combat pilot, more valuable teaching the trick than using it. Thach trained pilots for 18 months, teaching the weave to over 800 naval aviators. Every one of those pilots took the tactic into combat. Every one of them survived situations they shouldn't have. And every one of them told other pilots about the commander who saved their lives with matchsticks. The war ended in August 1945. Thach was 40 years old. He had flown 73 combat missions, scored 6 confirmed kills, and received multiple decorations. But none of that compared to the most important number. Over 2,000 American pilots survived the war because they knew how to weave. After the war, John Thach chose to stay in the Navy. He couldn't walk away from teaching. He spent the next 27 years training fighter pilots, developing tactics, and saving lives without firing a shot. He was promoted to commander in 1946, captain in 1952, and rear admiral in 1960. He commanded carrier groups during the Korean War, never flying combat again. But his pilots did, and every one of them knew the weave. Korean warfighter pilots officially called it the Thach Weave. No other tactic in military history carried a pilot's name while he was still alive. During Vietnam, the weave evolved. F-4 Phantom pilots adapted it for burst supersonic speeds, calling it the Fluid 4 formation. Same principle, same crossing pattern, different speeds. They used it against North Vietnamese MiGs. The MiG-17 could outturn the F-4 just as the Zero outturned the Wildcat. But the weave worked at 600 mph the same way it worked at 300. Thach retired from the Navy in 1973 as a 4-star admiral after 40 years of service. he moved back to San Diego. When reporters asked about the Weave, he always offered the same humble answer. It wasn't genius, it was desperation. I just wanted my boys to come home. Fighter pilots never forgot him. Every year on February 10th, the anniversary of the first Weave combat test, naval aviators would call Thach, thank him, and tell him stories about how the Weave saved their lives or their wingman's life. The Navy named a building after him in 1981, Thach Hall at Naval Air Station Pensacola, a fighter pilot training facility. Every naval aviator who earns their wings walks past a bronze plaque with Thach's face and 3 words: innovate, adapt, survive. Thach died on April 15, 2001, at 86. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew over 300 naval aviators, men who flew Wildcats in 1943, Phantoms in 1967, and Hornets in 1991. All of them alive because one commander thought about matchsticks. Today, the Thach Weave is still taught at every fighter pilot school in the United States military. The principle remains unchanged. 2 aircraft protecting each other, turning toward each other, crossing paths, surviving together. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola preserves Thach's original pack of matches in a glass case next to a model F-4F Wildcat. The label reads, Lieutenant Commander John Thach used these matches to develop the tactical innovation that saved over 2,000 American pilots during World War II. School groups walk past that case every day. Most don't stop, but fighter pilots always stop. They look at those matches. They understand. If this story moved you and reinforced the idea that ingenuity can triumph over superior technology, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube to show this incredible history to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications to rescue more forgotten stories of real heroism. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and if someone in your family served. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Admiral John Thach does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.